Good evening and welcome to World Changers Bible Study. I am Sandra Boyce and I am going to be your presenter this evening. And we are looking at a new series called Living a Life of Favour, Episodes in the Life of Joseph. I want to say welcome to you if it's your first time. Thank you for joining us. And I want to encourage you to subscribe to our channel. And when you do that and you hit the notification button, you will get notified of any new video that is posted. So please subscribe to our channel. I do also want to encourage you to follow us on Facebook as well. World Changers Bible Study is brought to you compliments of the Churches of God in the Garden Community in St. James and the Church of God in Silver Sands. So again, if it's your first time here, welcome. If it's not your first time, welcome back. So glad that you chose to join us this evening for our new Bible study session. Now, if you missed last week, it's okay. You can go back on our channel and you can watch episode 1 of our series. And while you're there, please take some time to look through our other Bible study sessions done by our pastor, the Reverend Lennox Boyce, and see how many of those you can glean from. There are studies there that will encourage you, that will lift you up, that will give you guidance and direction. So I want to encourage you to please go through our Bible study sessions on our channel and please participate and see how much you can glean. Now we're into a new series, as I said, and our new series is called Living a Life of Favour, Episodes in the Life of Joseph. We want to begin today by doing a little recap of what we would have shared last time before we go on to our new topic. And last week we looked at the whole idea of a framework for favor, God having a framework for favor. And we said that the word favor brings several connotations to our mind. When we talk about favor, persons usually associate the word favor with favorite or with favoritism. But as we discussed last week, favoritism and favorite are not the same thing as favor. We said that favoritism and favorite, those are things that are related to a special kind of treatment that is given to someone or something. But when we're speaking about favor, we are looking at the whole idea of the support or the approval of God. And so we said that as we look at the life of Joseph, we can see that Joseph had the support and he had the approval of God. And we looked at the whole idea of what favor involves and why Joseph had the favor of God on his life. And we said that Joseph had the favor of God on his life because, first of all, he loved God above all. More than anything, more than anyone, Joseph loved God. And that brought God's approval. And then we said that Joseph was faithful to God. Regardless of the things he faced, regardless of the circumstances that he had to deal with, he kept his faith and he kept his commitment to God. And that brought the approval of God. And then we said that Joseph was humble. Regardless of his circumstances, he never was boastful. He never claimed to be able to do anything that he couldn't do. Even when he was interpreting dreams, he always said, I'm not the person who's doing this, God is. So he kept himself humble, and that brought God's approval. And then we said, fourthly, that Joseph submitted to God's will. Regardless of the situations that Joseph faced daily or weekly or however often he faced them, regardless of those situations, Joseph was submissive to God's will. And that called for trusting God. He knew the God that he was serving. He knew that God was going to work out things for his good. And he was submissive to God's will. And so that also brought the approval of God. And so today, as we go into our new topic, we want to be taking a look. We're continuing the whole idea of when God has a plan, the framework for favor. And we want to take a look today at the consequences of favor. Now, when we hear the word consequences, we usually have a negative connotation about that word. But the word consequence simply means a result or an effect of an action. A result or an effect of an action. So we're going to look at the story of Joseph, and we're going to look to identify the results of having God's approval. What happened as a result of having God's approval? So here are some questions that we can ask. What happened to Joseph as a result of living a life approved by God? What happened to the people around him as a result of living a life approved by God? And then, what can we as believers glean from these situations that were recorded in the Word? So Joseph experienced many situations, and in each situation he displayed a behavior that was pleasing to God. He did what God instructed. He chose to follow God's way of living. And we want to look at a couple instances tonight as we look at the consequences of favor. So what are the results of having God's approval? What happens when God approves of your life? What are the consequences? So I want to suggest, first of all, that situations change because of the favor of God. Situations change because of the favor of God. And we're going to take a look at some verses. We're going to begin with Genesis chapter 39 and verse 5. And that verse says, "From the time he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field." And then Genesis chapter 39 and verse 21 says, "But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden." So from the time he put him in charge of his household, the household of the Egyptian was blessed. And then in the prison, the word says, the Lord was with Joseph and showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So we're looking at the whole idea of situations change because of the favor of God. If the favor of God is on your life, it should impact the lives of those around you. It should impact the lives of those around you. The people around you should be experiencing the overflow of God's blessings. The people around Joseph, the word says, experienced the overflow of the blessings of God just because Joseph was there in their presence. In Potiphar's house, the word says that everything in Potiphar's house flourished, both inside the house and outside. And even in the prison, everything flourished and went well because of the presence of Joseph. So my question to you is, who is being blessed because of your presence in their life? Who is being blessed because of the overflow of God's favor on your life? When we as believers are in situations or in circumstances, when we are in persons' sphere of influence, they should be blessed. They should experience the overflow of God in our lives, just as the persons around Joseph experienced the overflow of God's approval on his life. So, in your workplace, are those persons in your workplace experiencing that overflow? Are the neighbors in your community experiencing that overflow? Are the persons in your home experiencing that overflow? What situations around you are changing because of the favor of God in your life? What prisons are you impacting? What households are you changing? What impact are you having in the spaces where God has planted you? God is calling us as believers to demonstrate some of these characteristics that Joseph had. When we love God above all else, when we are faithful to him, when we do what he asks us to do, and that approval, that stamp of approval comes on our lives because of our obedience to him, the persons around us should be experiencing the overflow of God's approval in our life. That blessing that God gives to us because we do what he says should be so much felt and noticed that everyone around us should be able to see that overflow. So our situations at work and at home and at school and in our community, persons should be able to see that God has a stamp of approval on our life, and situations around us should change. Before Joseph went to Potiphar's house, there was no overflow, no blessing. But as soon as he got there, and as soon as he was put in charge, everything changed. When God plants us in situations, plants us in places, everything should change. When we are planted in places where God wants us to be, because of our presence there should be an impact. We should see a change in the atmosphere, a change in the community, a change in the school, a change in the workplace. God plants us in these places for a reason. He doesn't just put us there so that we can just exist. The idea is that the favor that he grants to us, the blessings he gives to us, when we do the things that he says, should be felt by those persons around us. When Joseph went to that prison, there was a change. The situation in the prison changed because of Joseph's presence. And our encouragement this evening is that wherever God plants us, wherever we are, there should be a change in the situation. When we come into a space, when we come into a situation, the presence of God should be felt so strongly that there is a change in that situation. It should be noticed that the overflow of the blessing of God in our lives is there. So, situations change because of the favor of God. And not only do situations change because of the favor of God, but I want to also suggest this evening that setups lead to step-ups because of the favor of God. I'm going to say that again. Setups lead to step-ups because of the favor of God. What do I mean by that? Let's have a look at the chapter Genesis 39. Now, we can't go through every verse in that chapter in detail this evening, but I want to encourage you when we are finished our session to go back and read Genesis chapter 39. Now, Genesis chapter 39 gives us the account of Potiphar's wife and Joseph. And I'm not going to assume that you know the story. I'm just going to give you a synopsis. Now, we said earlier that when Joseph came into Potiphar's house, everything changed. The situation became better. Potiphar's house began to flourish inside and outside. And Potiphar, the ruler of this house, the master of this house, gave Joseph ownership, or he gave him the ability to be able to rule his house. And Potiphar's wife, it is said, looked at Joseph and was infatuated by him. And she encouraged him, or tried to encourage him, to sleep with her. But Joseph, as he said, how can I do this great thing and sin against God? Joseph's number one priority was God and pleasing God. And so in Genesis chapter 39, Potiphar's wife tried to set up Joseph. She lied about her interactions with him when Joseph refused to sleep with her. She lied to her husband about his interactions with her. She lied about his behavior towards her. And it seemed as if Joseph was now receiving the short end of the stick. Imagine coming from flourishing and being in charge and running everything and having all authority, to now being lied upon, to now being accused of something you did not do. So here Joseph was experiencing now a setup. Potiphar's wife set him up, or was trying to set him up for a fall. But what she did not know was that the setup that she was trying to do was going to lead to a step up because of God's favor on Joseph's life. So consider this. If Joseph had not left Potiphar's house to go to the prison, he never would have met the cupbearer and the baker. And if he had never met the cupbearer and the baker, he would never have been recommended by the cupbearer to interpret Joseph's dream. And if he had never been recommended by the cupbearer to interpret Pharaoh's dream, if he had never been recommended by the cupbearer to interpret Pharaoh's dream, he would never have had the opportunity to leave the prison and to be able to take over the rulership, take over the kingdom of Egypt, and to be able to manage those situations that needed him to be there. So if Joseph had never left the prison, he would not have been able to be present in the palace. If Joseph had never left Potiphar's house, he would not have been able to be present in the palace. So let's think about it. Setups lead to step-ups because of the favor of God. What made the difference in this setup? Joseph was set up by Potiphar's wife to take a fall because he would not comply with her wishes. What was different in this setup? The difference in this setup is that Joseph had the favor of God on his life, number one. Number two, Joseph was doing what God asked him to do, and that was the difference. Now, if Joseph had given in to Potiphar's wife, and then she had complained to her husband the same complaint, the outcome would not have been the same. But Joseph refused to comply with her wishes, and because he chose to do what God wanted him to do, to be obedient to God, God honored him. And that setup, that apparent setup, was a part of the process to lead him to the step up that God had planned for him. So he had to leave Potiphar's house. He had to go to the prison because he had to meet the cupbearer. And then he had to leave the prison in order to get to the palace. So let's think about this. Sometimes the enemy plants setups in our lives, or he tries to set up things in our lives. So for Joseph, what seemed like a downward trend was really an upward move. And sometimes God will do things in our lives that seem to be going downward, that seems to be a downward trend. Sometimes we have setups in our lives. Sometimes the enemy brings things, or situations, a setup in our life. Something that seems to want to take us downhill, or something that seems to want to take us away from the plan that we think God has for our lives. Sometimes God will do things that will look as if it's taking us further away. But setups can lead to step-ups if we have the favor of God on our lives. So Joseph trusted God above everything else. And I believe that he knew in his heart that regardless of what he was going through, that God had a perfect outcome for him. Reminds me of the verse that says, I know the plans God has for me. Jeremiah chapter 29 and verse 11. I know the plans God has for me. When we trust in God, when we recite that verse, when we depend on that verse, when we rely on the promises of God, even though it seems like there are setups in our lives, we have to believe that God can use these setups as step-ups for us to take us to his intended end, to take us to the intended goal that he has for us in his life. So what seemed like a downward trend for Joseph was really a step in an upward move towards the final end where God wanted to take him. Now, did you ever think about the whole idea that God knew from the beginning where Joseph was going to end up? God knew that when Joseph's brothers sold him in Egypt, that he was going to end up in Pharaoh's palace. But did Joseph know this? No, he didn't. Joseph could not see the steps, the process that he would have to go through to end up where he ended up, to end up in the palace. But God knew. So God had a framework in place. And sometimes as we go through our lives, we do not know where God is taking us. We do not know the goal he has in mind for us. We do not know the end of the process that he's taken us through to bring us to the completion. But there is a word that says, he who begun a work in you will be faithful to complete it until the very end. And we have to be able to trust in the promises of God, even when situations look as if they're not working out in our favor, even when things look as though they're going the opposite direction from where we think they should go, even when there is a setup. People will try to set us up. They may tell lies on you. They may try to bring situations to try to cause you to be diverted from where you should be. They may try to say things about you that are not true and to try to discredit your character. But I want to encourage us this evening, when we have the favor of God on our lives, when we love God above all else, when we are faithful to him and we are submissive to his will, when we are obedient to him and we do the things that he tells us to do, just as Joseph was, setups can lead to step-ups because of his favor. So I want to encourage us this evening, do not allow the enemy's setups to take us away from where God is taking us. So don't give in because everyone else is. Don't blend in. Don't give up. Remember that if God's favor is on your life, he can create a step up out of these setups. And so thirdly and finally, I want to encourage us to live a life that God approves of. Regardless of the company around us, regardless of the situations we face, regardless of the things that we have to deal with, live a life that God approves of. If you live a life that God approves of, he will make sure that all the things he has planned for you, you will be able to see come to fruition, just as he did for Joseph. So Proverbs chapter 3, verse 1 to 4 says, "My son, do not forget my teaching, but keep my commands in your heart, for they will prolong your life many years and bring you peace and prosperity. Let love and faithfulness never leave you. Bind them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart. Then you will win favor and a good name in the sight of God and man." Here are these instructions from Proverbs. Number 1, don't forget God's teaching. Number 2, keep God's commands because they're going to bring you peace and prosperity. Number 3, let love and faithfulness never leave you. Bind them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart. And if you do these things, if you follow these instructions, God has promised that you will win his favor. You will win his favor. And so, let's just recap. We want to make sure that we understand that situations can change because of God's favor in our life. And we also want to understand that setups can lead to step-ups because of God's favor on our life. And thirdly and finally, this evening, I want to remind us that statuses are changed because of God's favor on our life. Statuses are changed because of God's favor on our life. Now in chapter 40, and I want you to go and read through these chapters, chapter 39 and chapter 40. In chapter 40, Joseph meets the king's cupbearer and the baker. And after sharing their dreams with Joseph, he's able to interpret them. Both men are eventually released, as he said they would be, and both dreams come true, as he said they would be. And the cupbearer promised Joseph that he was going to tell the Pharaoh what was happening and have him released. But the cupbearer forgot to mention Joseph's name to Pharaoh. In fact, the word tells us very explicitly that it is 2 more years before the cupbearer remembers Joseph. And he remembers Joseph because Pharaoh had a dream that no one could interpret. And suddenly, he remembers when he was in prison, there was someone who interpreted his dream. And so he says to Pharaoh, I know a man who interpreted my dream, who said to me, this is what your dream means. And it came to pass exactly as he said it was. And so Pharaoh says, bring him to me. And the word says They went for Joseph and they changed him up, they fixed him up and dressed him up, and immediately his status was changed. Immediately his status was changed. He moved from being a prisoner to being a prophet because he was able to tell Pharaoh the meaning of his dream. And then he moved from being a prophet to being a prime minister. Now, the word tells us that when Joseph came to Egypt, he was just 17 years old. And the word also tells us that when Joseph became the prime minister of Egypt, he was 30 years old. Now, if your mathematics is good, it's about 13 years. The story of Joseph is about 13 years. It took 13 years for Joseph to move from Potiphar's house to the prison to the palace. Now, Joseph must have been relieved when he was finally released from prison, when he was finally able to interpret Pharaoh's dream, when he was finally able to be given this honor by Pharaoh, when he was finally able to be in charge of Egypt, when he was finally able to be in an authoritative position. He must have been relieved when he looked back on all he went through and where God had placed him and where he was presently. Now, that dream he had of the sun and the moon and the 11 stars bowing down to him, that must have come back to him at some point in time. And he must have said to himself, God, this is what you were saying. This is what you were showing me 13 years ago. And sometimes we may be like Joseph. Did God have a plan for Joseph's life? Was there a framework in place? Yes, there was. Sometimes we may feel like Joseph, as if there is no plan, as if the plan is taking forever to come to fruition, as if everything else is happening except what we think should happen, as if everything is going the wrong way, everything is going wrong. But Joseph kept himself faithful. Joseph was submissive and constant in his relationship with God. And that brought God's approval, God's support, God's favor. The status of Joseph's life changed in the blink of an eye. And I want to say to us this evening that our status can change in the blink of an eye. Sometimes God takes us through places. He takes us through prisons. He takes us through challenges and situations before he brings us to the palace. There's a word that says in Isaiah that when we walk through the water, that it will not overflow us. And when we walk through the fire, it will not burn us. But God has promised us that when we go through these situations, that he will never leave us or forsake us. So even as Joseph went through so many situations, through Potiphar's house, through the prison, before he eventually came to the palace. And he was faithful to God in every situation. He was submissive to God in every situation. He kept his word. He kept to God's word, and he kept his promises to God. And he listened and he was obedient to God. God is saying to us this evening that if we want to experience his favor, if we want to see situations change around us, if we want to see him change our setups to step-ups, and if we want to see our status in our situations change, we have to do what is needed to receive his approval, his support, his favor. Joseph received God's support, his approval, and his favor because he lived a life that pleased God. He was obedient to God's calling. Sometimes God gives us instructions. God gives us promises. He tells us to do things. And because we cannot see or we cannot understand what the outcome will be or where it will lead us, we are disobedient. And when we are disobedient, we cannot claim the promises of God. So as we bring our session to a close this evening, I just want to recap for us the topics that we looked at this evening, and we spoke about the whole idea of situations changing when God's favor is on your life. We spoke about the whole idea of setups being changed to step-ups when the favor of God is on your life. We spoke about the idea of statuses being changed when the favor of God is on your life. Now, in every example that we think about with Joseph, as we look at the whole idea of what he went through, what he had to face, what he had to deal with, the fact that God's favor was on his life was the thing that kept him going. The fact that God approved of his life, I believe, is the thing that kept him going. And so I want to encourage us tonight. You may be faced with many situations. You may be faced with many challenges. And I want to encourage you and remind you tonight that when God's favor or God's support or approval is on your life, that you are able to face any challenge or any situation. Because when we have God on our side, when we have God in our corner, we have the most important person on our side. We have the most important person rooting for us. That is what will give us the strength that we need to carry on. That is what will give us the confidence that we need to carry on. And when we keep trusting in God's word, when we keep relying on his promises, that is what will help us to be able to carry on. Remember, God had a plan for Joseph, just as he has a plan for you. And I want to remind us this evening that whenever the enemy tries to bring situations to challenge you, do as Joseph did. Trust in God, rely on his promises, be obedient to his word, and I promise you that the favor of God will rest on your life. I just want to recap that verse that we shared from Proverbs 3, verse 1 to 4 as we close this evening. My son, do not forget my teaching, but 1, keep my commands in your heart. They will prolong your life many years and bring you peace and prosperity. 2, let love and faithfulness never leave you. Bind them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart. Then you will win favor and a good name in the sight of God and man. And that's where we're going to end our session for this evening. I do want to thank you for joining us for World Changers Bible Study today, our new series entitled Living a Life of Favor, Episodes in the Life of Joseph. Remember, follow us on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel. World Changers Bible Study is brought to you compliments of the Churches of God in the Garden in St. James and Church of God in Silver Sands Christchurch. Thank you for joining us. I do look forward to sharing with you again next time. See you next week. God bless you.